I'm Julie Peterson, Vice President for Communications. I'm really pleased you were able to join us on this beautiful afternoon. I know it's kind of hard to come inside when the sun is shining so beautifully, but I promise you there's 4 or 5 more days of this coming, so we'll be able to give up this hour and a half. I think this is a topic important to all of us as scholars, as communicators, and as citizens, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker today. Tom Rosenstiel is the founding director of the Pew Research Center's Project for Excellence in Journalism, a nonpartisan organization that studies trends in the media and the performance of the press. He is the editor and principal author of the Pew Center's annual report on the state of the news media, a comprehensive report on the health of American journalism. He also serves as vice chairman of the Committee of ConcernedJournalists, a group which is conducting a national conversation among journalists about standards and values. A journalist for more than 20 years, Tom is a former media critic for the Los Angeles Times and MSNBC, and he was chief congressional correspondent for Newsweek magazine. He's the author of a number of books on journalism, including a textbook that is used in journalism schools worldwide. His writing also has appeared in publications such as Esquire, The New Republic, The New York Times, Columbia Journalism Review, and The Washington Monthly. The work that Tom and his colleagues do has never been more important than it is today. An independent press is a key element of our democracy, yet powerful forces are changing profoundly the nature of the news media. And these forces have been accelerating within the past 6 months. A number of traditional news organizations have declared bankruptcy, and others have stopped publishing altogether. At the same time, new forms of media are springing up daily. I had the pleasure of hearing Tom speak on these issues at a conference in Washington recently. And while I was in his session, I got a news alert on my phone. I was reading my phone, sad to say, that the Ann Arbor News in Michigan will go out of print in July. Many of you know I came from Ann Arbor before I came to the university 2 years ago. Already, the Detroit Free Press there publishes print editions only 3 days a week, and the Detroit News publishes in print only 2 days a week. That means that Ann Arbor, home to the University of Michigan and one of the most highly educated communities in the United States, soon will have only one daily newspaper. That's the student newspaper at the University of Michigan. I found that to be really astounding and kind of symptomatic of what we're dealing with. But I also do like to think that these trends are creating enormous opportunity for us. Many of you who work with me in my office know we've been talking about this nonstop for the past few weeks. And I hope that our discussion will wander all over the map in terms of not only what trends are we seeing and what are we losing, but what could we be gaining and what kinds of ideas could we generate out of that. So Tom will share his analysis of current trends and the challenges and opportunities that are being created by this rapidly changing media landscape. And then after his presentation, we hope to have plenty of time for questions and discussion and that you'll be informal about that part of it. So let me invite Tom up to the stage.
Hopefully my mic is on. We're going to talk a little bit about where the media culture is going, what the implications are, what might be done. But before I get into that, a little feedback going on. But before I get into that, just a couple of minutes about what the Pew Research Center's Project for Excellence in Journalism is, who I am, why you should listen to me. I was approached about 13 years ago to create a think tank to study the press, and at the time we were worried about infotainment, and those concerns bled away a little bit, and we began to worry about conglomeration as Time Warner and AOL were merging, and Viacom was becoming a behemoth, and Disney was buying ABC. And no one was talking about the internet or thinking about the internet. And here we are in 2009 trying to figure out what about a revolution that when we were founded wasn't on anyone's radar screen. Even 3 years ago, what I'm going to describe to you was largely not what people thought was going to happen. What we do at PEJ is we analyze the media in a couple of different levels. We first of all, we study 54 different news outlets and about 1 million blogs every week or every day. And each week we issue a report on what the media covered last week and what the blogs were talking about. And these are two separate reports. One's called the New Media Index and another's called the News Coverage Index. And we compare them to see how these different media are operating. We also issue opportunistic studies in addition to these weekly reports. Last year we issued 20 studies, for instance, on the presidential campaign. And then each March we produce the report that's called the State of the News Media. And that report, which we do annually, is 180,000 words. For those of you who've written books, you'll know that that's about 2 books. And for those of you who aspire to write books, I recommend that you not aspire to write 180,000 words every year. When we started, or even 4 years ago, as people began to see the internet begin to change the landscape, I think a lot of people imagined that what was going to happen was that as people had access to many more sources, that they would abandon many of the norms and values that traditional journalists aspired to. The idea that journalists would be there as a filter was an annoyance, and that people would gravitate to other kinds of sources, and good riddance to journalists and their sort of self-referential set of values, norms, and self-aggrandizement. Well, is that what's happening? Why is it that we hear about newspapers dying? Where are these people going? What's really going on here? And how big a deal is it? Isn't this just the same thing that's happened when television came in 50 years ago, or radio 80 years ago? What's the difference, if there is a difference? Well, what I'm going to give you right now is a snapshot of where we are at the beginning of 2009 and what I think that snapshot is telling us about the future. Assuming that I can work the computer, that would be the first sign of whether I'm competent to tell you where the technology is going. Okay, this slide is an indication of what happened to audiences as a percentage change in the audiences of different news platforms last year, 2008. Magazines saw their audiences decline about 5%. Newspapers also, circulation down about 5%. Local TV news audiences down 6%. Network TV, this is a pretty soft number, to be perfectly blunt. But network audiences for evening and morning news fell about 400,000 for evening news, which is about half of what it had been dropping for the last 15 years annually. Radio, this is an even softer number. This might be below the line or above the line, depending on which metric you use. But online, this number is the top 50 news websites saw their audience grow 27%. That's the top 50 news websites. Included in that number, by the way, are most of the major newspaper chains, which have their websites counted as groups. So the McClatchy chain, the Tribune chain are in there. And then cable news actually saw its audience grow almost 40% last year. I would argue that this is less of a structural change than this is. This was because, in our studies, cable news devoted 63% of all of its news time to the election. And that's a story-specific phenomenon. We'll know more in a few months about what's happening with cable audiences. Well, this is what happened with revenue. Okay, we saw in the previous slide whose audience was going up. So what we see here is that the revenue for magazines is down drastically more than the audience. The same for newspapers. You're looking at a 17% drop in advertising revenue based on a 6% drop in circulation. Radio, even though its audience was up, is seeing an alarming, almost double-digit drop in revenue. Local TV holding on to its revenue okay, but when I show you this, if I showed you this slide next year, what we're seeing is already in the first quarter 25 to 40% declines in local TV revenue. A big reason being that the biggest advertising sector for local television is automobiles. Network TV held on pretty well, but again, this would be much grimmer this year. But what's going on over here? The internet saw its audience grow by 27% at the top news sites. This is overall online ad growth in 2008, less than 5%. And if I showed you newspapers alone, newspapers saw their online ad revenue drop year to year. It was negative. It's not growing commensurate with the audience growth. The only one that really enjoyed a benefit commensurate with its audience boom was cable. And again, that was specific. Cable news got a large share of the political advertising last year. Obama had so much money that instead of buying local ads, which candidates traditionally do, he started to buy national ads, and particularly cable. And McCain was falling behind so everywhere and had so many battleground states that he had to basically follow suit. What those two slides tell us, in other words, is that the challenge that journalism is facing is not fundamentally an audience challenge. The problem facing journalism, traditional journalism as we know it, news gathering and informing civic society, at least from a professional standpoint, that is a revenue problem. The fundamental issue is that the internet is decoupling advertising from news for a variety of reasons. Number one, if you're an advertiser, you don't need the news anymore to reach your audience. If you're Toyota and I want to find out about a Toyota, I can go to their website. I don't need to wait for the newspaper. If you're Best Buy or if you want to buy something at Best Buy, it's great because we have the same stores everywhere now, so I can give this talk and not have to know what the local retailers are. If you want to find out what's on sale at Best Buy, you don't have to wait for the Sunday inserts to come, all those things that fall out of the Sunday paper. You can go to their website at 3 in the morning. Not only find out what they've got, you could actually buy it. The other thing is that the whole interface that we have as consumers online is drastically different than the one we have particularly in print. In print, and studies have shown this for generations, people look on the ads as content that they appreciate. They actually like it. They're turning the page. They're there to see, what does this news organization have to tell me? And they turn the page, and there's an ad, and they say, oh, that's kind of interesting. I'll look at that or not. And if I don't want to look at it, I'll keep turning to the next page. But you're there in a passive posture to some significant degree to see what is it that the news organization is telling you about what the agenda is. Online, you are a hunter-gatherer. You Google in what it is you want to find out about, and you look through the links until you see the one that is closest to the question that you're trying to answer. And when you finally click on that link, the last thing you frankly want is a pop-up ad to interrupt you at the very moment of discovery. So here's some stats that illustrate this. Traditional news sites saw their audiences grow sharply, while online revenue growth flattened and newspapers fell. As the slide showed us, traffic to the top 50 news websites grew 27%. Interestingly, traffic to the top 700 sites offering news and information grew only 7%. Now, what is that telling us? These are traditional news sites. This list includes the long tail of blogs and alternative news and information sites. The big online are actually getting bigger. To give you one more statistic that illustrates this, the top 10 newspapers in print command 19% of the circulation in print. The top 10 newspaper websites command 29% of newspaper website traffic. So the notion that the web is simply democratizing isn't true when you look at traffic. The big brands in news are benefiting more. There was one analysis done by a guy at Arizona State looking at all of the traditional news websites and all of the alternative news websites and blogs. And he said that the audience, at least right now, for traditional news websites, it's 300 times the size of the combined collected audience of all that long tail of alternative news. So you have growth in the audience, and yet the price of an online ad last year, amid this growth, dropped by almost half. Why? Well, two reasons. One is that interface that is not so beneficial to the advertiser. Advertisers are not keen on the results they're getting. But the second thing is the fact that there are so many sites. There's no scarcity of places that people can advertise. And so the price of buying an ad is dropping while the audience is growing. One more point about this. What it means is that the challenge, if journalism is going to survive, is not necessarily purely a content challenge or reaching audiences. It's figuring out some other new way to subsidize journalism. Essentially, in the 20th century, we had a happy accident. We discovered, almost by accident, that commercial advertising could subsidize a public good, journalism. That happy accident, which did not exist nearly as much, really didn't exist much at all in the 19th century, but was a byproduct of the commercial culture after the Industrial Revolution, and was really discovered by newspapers in the 20th century, advertising. That happy accident is disintegrating. And if journalism on a professional level is going to survive, the news institutions, whether they're new ones or old ones, are going to have to figure out some other financial model other than advertising. Had I given this talk 3 years ago, the numbers would have shown online advertising going up by 1/3. And I would have said, okay, the challenge here is that growth rate is very robust, but it's not fast enough. It'll take 15 years for online advertising to get to the point where it would be the size of print advertising, or even the size, it would take 10 years for it to be the size of TV advertising. Well, here we are 3 years later, and what I'm saying is it'll never happen, because already newspaper online advertising is in the negative. That advertising is just not going to do it. The other thing I would add to this, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, is that the traditional newspaper industry had lots of opportunities in the last 10 years to develop alternative economic models and didn't do it. My old company, Times Mirror, was offered the chance at one point to buy Google for very little money. But they decided, or they said, search is not journalism. Aggregation is not journalism. Well, actually it is today, but it's not happening inside the Times Mirror company. As a consequence of that financial background, what's going on inside newsrooms and in the news culture right now? Let's just take a few minutes to talk about that. The first one change is that the media culture is focusing more, not to the exclusion of the old, but is focusing more on pushing content out, not just bringing audiences in. What does that mean? It means if you've got good content, good journalism, or good anything that you've created, There is more effort now inside traditional news organizations to get that stuff out into RSS feeds, into other people's websites, into widgets, into that great stream, that rapidly moving and expanding stream of information flow so that people can have access to it. They're not necessarily simply trying to bring people in for lots and lots of reasons. One of them is that at the New York Times, which is about as good a brand as you can have, right? 2/3 of the traffic to the New York Times website arrives there through links, not from people coming to the front page of the New York Times. That's people going online and saying, I'm looking to find the answer to X. And they end up at the New York Times, but they didn't intend to go there. That is the number one reason that the New York Times abandoned Times Select, its paywall, because they were, at the time, this is 2 years ago, they thought they were losing more traffic than they were gaining revenue. Because when you arrive at a website through links, or somebody emails you a story, or you Google search something, and this is one of the links that you get. If you hit a paywall, the tendency is to say, well, I'll just go down to the next link that's free. I don't really want to whip out my credit card and figure out whether I want to subscribe and all that other stuff, because there's a million other places I can go. So that notion of pushing content out, that's a paradigm shift that's going on in newsrooms. Another idea, very important now, is that partnership is becoming a major focus of how news organizations are going to try and survive. Basically, the notion is, as you're shrinking your newsroom, do only what you can do best and borrow the rest. Borrow it from somewhere else. Now, this is a dramatic shift. 2 years ago, we did a content analysis of 30 major news websites of various different stripes. And traditional news websites like the New York Times, the Washington Post, they were what we call walled gardens. What you would find there was only content that they had produced. Their notion of what their brand was their stuff. Largely their stories, their narratives. Today, the notion that a website would be sufficiently attractive to an audience if it only contained original material is obsolete. A good website is a place that not only has good material that you've produced, but can show you all the other good material that other people have produced, and maybe is a good aggregator of all the stuff that's out there on the web. But this is also simply an economic reality. My old newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, has half the staff that it had 3 years ago. The Washington Post, which is operated at a loss these days by the Graham family, has about a third of the staff that it had. It's reduced its staff by about a third from 2 years ago. So how do you suggest that your news product hasn't been drastically reduced? It's by borrowing more. Another implication of all of this is that power is shifting by degrees to the individual journalist and away from the journalistic institutional brand. There's a site called Global Voices. Global Voices is a site set up by a group at Harvard that is essentially a foreign news site in which the journalists are freelancers, freelance foreign correspondents. Many of them work for places like the Christian Science Monitor. They're paid $1,000 a month by Global Voices to be their sort of staff foreign correspondents. That is not enough to support a foreign correspondent, his or her family, and also their expenses, et cetera, overseas. But the notion is that might give them enough of a base that they could cobble together several of these things. So if you're a former foreign correspondent who used to work for the Boston Globe, which has eliminated its foreign staff, this might be the beginning of something that could become a basis for you. But it also means, this is also a reflection of the fact that in the blogosphere and in Google searches, that it may not be the New York Times that people are going to, it may be David Brooks or Paul Krugman, and that's what's getting the traffic. He happens to work for the New York Times, but that's not where you find him. You find him on the big internet machine, and he's in there. And your friends are emailing these columns to you. If they left the New York Times, you probably still follow them. Or maybe it's Andrew Sullivan. Used to be at the New Republic. Now he's at andrewsullivan.com. You will see more of that. One word I think is worth making about what we saw with cable and with CNN and Fox and MSNBC last year. You have to reckon with the fact that this medium had so much success, even if we think that it was a story-specific phenomenon. What is the implication of that? Well, one is that these media practice what I call the journalism of assertion, first of all. They're so fast that the old notion of what journalism was is what I call the journalism of verification. If your mother says she loves you, check it out before you print it, which is an old line from the Chicago News Service, City News Service of Chicago. On cable, there isn't time to do that. They fill 18 hours of news, and one of my oldest and closest friends was a presidential press secretary, Mike McCurry. And Mike used to say, if you got him liquored up enough, the great thing about cable is from my brain to their lips. In other words, they didn't have time to basically vet things. Well, that essentially is my description of what cable was like in the 1980s and the early 90s. Today, cable is also practicing another kind of journalism, the journalism of affirmation. Particularly in prime time, particularly on Fox and MSNBC, the appeal is that they affirm your preconceptions that you brought to the news in the first place. So those are two entirely different models of journalism in which vetting the news is a lesser value because there isn't time to do it. And now the notion of independence is reduced somewhat. And this is different than the journalism of opinion that we're sort of accustomed to in the National Review and the Nation and the Weekly Standard and places like that, because these places are delivering the news. They're doing newscasts. They're giving you new facts. They're not commenting on last week's news. They're not making arguments. And I'll talk a little bit later about what the appeal of some of those shows are. But what's the effect of that kind of journalism gaining such force in 2008? Well, one effect is that they spend a lot of time that they hand over to political surrogates. We did content analysis of their campaign coverage, and a significant amount of the time on cable news, you're not listening to journalists. You're listening to party surrogates, often not labeled as such, talking about why Obama's great or why Obama is a communist pig, depending on the point of view of the speaker. And those people are labeled CNN analyst, CNN contributor, Fox contributor, MSNBC contributor. The other effect of that is that they are accelerating the influence of minute-by-minute judgments in political journalism. The notion that Obama had a honeymoon, that we would reserve judgment for 60 or 90 days, I think is an antiquated notion. He was judged to be a president in trouble after 10 days because he was having trouble getting a couple of his appointments to the cabinet confirmed, which is not unusual, but there isn't a lot of historical perspective in the minute-by-minute judgments that you see on cable. A larger effect of all of this is, and this makes me very sad coming from the traditional press, is that the traditional reportorial press, even our best news-gathering organizations, are becoming more passive and reactive, more of an enabler of the newsmakers they cover, more of a conduit for them. Why is that? Why do I say that? Because they've got fewer people in their newsrooms and a bigger news hole to fill because they've got websites and video and all kinds of other things to do. To give you just a couple of statistics, in 1992, David Marinas of the Washington Post did 13 major biographical profiles of the eventual winner, Bill Clinton, and won a Pulitzer Prize for the work. In 2008, the Washington Post, in total, all staffers, did 3 major biographical profiles of the eventual winner, Barack Obama. My old newspaper in 2008 did 1/3 the number of enterprise political campaign pieces that they did in 1992, the year that Clinton won. A year, by the way, in which we sent 2 people to live in Little Rock, Arkansas for 18 months and turn over everything that we could find about Bill Clinton's background. That just isn't on the radar screen. And so while not only does Barack Obama have 13 million emails that he can contact people through directly, the press that is following him is spending more of its time, as a percentage of its time, simply trying to keep up with what he's saying, and less time turning over rocks about things that he might not want the press to be doing. And Barack Obama may be a popular character here, but I think it's not a good thing for the president to be enabled by the press. They need to be covered by the press. So what does all this mean for the traditional press if it's can no longer function in the role that it once did of being in the gatekeeper? And what does that mean, the gatekeeper? The gatekeeper is the metaphor that we used for most of the 20th century to describe what the press did. And in a nutshell, the gatekeeper metaphor meant that if I'm the newsmaker and you were the public, that I needed to go through the press to reach you. Julie's the press. And I had to go through her, and she would decide whether what I said is true or not true and decide whether you should know it. There's a quote from a book by Walter Lippmann called Liberty in the News, in which he talked about the role of the press. The press is there to sift through the rumor, the gossip, the innuendo, and the facts that flow through a newsroom. And Lippmann, in his romantic notion of this press, called it one of the sacred and priestly functions in a democratic society. I'm mauling the quote a little bit, but simply because I'm too old to remember it exactly. We're in a culture now where we may be standing by a gate, but there's no fence on either side because there's so many other ways for newsmakers to reach the public. So what is the metaphor or the function of a press in this new culture? Well, these describe what I can tell you from spending a lot of time with journalists would be what they aspire to do in the 21st century. These are the new roles of the modern press, of the next journalism. The first one is to be an authenticator. What does that mean? It's to tell people, what here of all the stuff that I've heard can I believe? Tell me what's true and what's not true, because I'm hearing a lot of things from a lot of places. And so the press aspires to say, this you can trust, this you should not trust. And that's a new role, by the way. I wrote a book about the Lewinsky scandal, and one of the sort of what we considered a startling thing back in 1998 was a lead in the Chicago Tribune. The lead of the story was ABC News reported yesterday that Monica Lewinsky, a third party had witnessed Monica Lewinsky and the president in a delicate situation or something like that. Period, paragraph. If true, comma, this could mean the following things. The notion that a news organization would publish something and didn't know if it was true was a new and troubling phenomenon a decade ago. In response to that, the press now aspires to recognize that it may have to write about stuff that other people have reported that isn't true, and they aspire to play the role of telling people whether they can believe it or not. A second role that journalists aspire to is a sense maker. What is a sense maker? Help me make sense of all this stuff that I'm hearing. Help me put it into context. When information is in greater supply, knowledge is harder to create because you have to sift through more stuff to make sense of it. Now, this is why Bill O'Reilly is the most popular person on cable and why Keith Olbermann is the fastest growing figure on cable. Because they create the impression for their audiences that they are sense makers, that they are helping people make sense of it. I have my own view of whether they are really sense makers or not, but that is very much part of why they and Rachel Maddow and Lou Dobbs and others are gaining force. Because the idea of simply putting more information out there is not as appealing for people as somebody who can help them create the sense that they're making order out of it. The third role that journalists clearly aspire to is to be a watchdog, because in all this new media that's out there, in all these other blogs, in all these other alternative websites, the amount of original reporting that's going on is still, at this point, and I think it may change, still fairly limited. And the old notion that the press is there, another Lippmann line, to project a spotlight onto darkness and to bring things into the light, this is something that news organizations recognize they may be uniquely still suited to do and can help their financial franchise, can build brand in an environment where it's hard to build brand. A new role, however, is to be a forum leader, to actually let the public talk about the news and to organize those forums in useful ways. And these last two are newer. One is to be a role model. And this is something I've only heard journalists begin to talk about in the last few months. What does that mean, a role model? What kind of a role model? A role model for whom? As citizens in various forms begin to be eyewitnesses for themselves, to be citizen sentinels, they inevitably start to look to the people who've done this stuff before, journalists, and say, how do I do this? There's a newspaper in Kansas that has created a university program for people at night, taught by both journalists and university professors, for people who want to do their own journalism. And the newspaper does this because they want to find out who these folks are and see if they've got skills that they can then bring into the newspaper in some way by including their citizen-produced content. But clearly, this notion that we'll help you, we'll show you how to do this. We don't resent your doing this. We want to not just use your material, but we want to help you, guide you. And then the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sixth role that journalists clearly aspire to is to be an aggregator, but not in the sense that Google is, not in the sense that an algorithm presents everything that's on the web to you, 59,000 citations, but maybe 59 citations that I'd want to look at today. Help me learn more. Where can you help me learn more? This is part of the idea that journalism is shifting from being a product, my stories, here's my stories that I wrote for you today, to being something else, to being a service. How can I help you answer your questions? By giving you access to other things, by including my stories, but also all kinds of other things, giving you tools to help you create knowledge. In a sense, the modern newsroom of the 21st century, if it's going to survive at all, will be a place that acquires knowledge, gathers it, and then makes it available, not writes stories. 10 years ago, I could go to the Columbia Journalism School, as I often did, and go to meetings and hear people talk and say, journalism is storytelling. That's what we do. We write stories. We tell stories for people. Well, that definition of journalism, which is not, which you could have heard just a few years ago, is not close to being sufficient now. That's in there somewhere, but there's so much more to it. Now, I started by saying that the fundamental problem facing journalism was a revenue problem. And one of the frustrations that we have now is that the debate over what is journalism going to do is in many ways very truncated. Time magazine, Walter Isaacson got a lot of traction for doing a cover story that said the key to the future is micropayments. Make people pay story by story for anything they consume on the web. Other people have said the original sin was not creating paywalls. And some people have talked a lot about the potential of nonprofit ownership. Maybe we can get philanthropy to take over the press because advertising is drying up. And when I say advertising is drying up on the web, I don't mean it's drying up a little bit. Roughly about 40% of the revenue to newspapers came from classified advertising, a little more some places, a little less some places. Half of all classified advertising in newspapers is gone completely, not coming back. In 5 years, most predict there will be zero classified advertising in newspapers. So the problems we're facing in print are going to get worse. I think there are severe limitations to the public debate we're having over financing right now. For one thing, newspapers alone took in a bad year, last year, $45 billion in revenue. Now, if you eliminate the profit, newspapers averaged 11% profit last year. That takes you down to about $39 billion. Let's say you eliminate all print and delivery from newspapers, which, by the way, would eliminate 90% of your revenue, because 90% of the revenue in newspapers comes from print advertising, only 10% from online advertising. So you eliminate print and delivery. That will save you 40% of your costs, but it'll eliminate 90% of your revenue. So it may not be a good idea to do that. But even if you did, you've still got to come up with about $20 billion in revenue just to finance newspapers at a break-even level last year. That's an awful lot of money for nonprofits to generate. The paywall, or the notion that you could get people to pay for content, while that's important, that too doesn't solve the problem. Newspapers make 20% of their revenue, only 20% of their revenue from circulation. And even if you got that number up, let's say you got it up to 30% of your revenue from circulation on the web, that means that you're going to have to reduce your newsrooms by 70% of their size. So what are some other things that that have been talked about and could be discussed? Well, one is the cable model. What do we mean by that? Well, in cable, you pay a subscription fee to Fox and the Golf Channel and the Food Channel and every other channel that is on your cable system. But it's embedded in your cable bill every month. That's why your cable bill is so high, for one thing. But it's not an a la carte menu. The one place that people pay for the Internet is in their Internet access fee. I pay 3 Internet access fees every month. One for this gizmo, one at home, and one at the office. So I pay about $90, about $100 a month for Internet access. That is the toll booth that is pre-existing. So one option is it feasible for the cable, the Internet access companies, which is a shrinking number, we'll be down to probably 4 Internet access companies in a year or two, for them to build in a fee for journalism. There are a lot of logistical challenges there. Who's in, who's out, how much does each one get? I think the bigger problem is who's in and who's out. Who would you call a journalist who would get some of this content production fee? Figuring out how much of their would go to each is simpler. You could do that based on traffic. Another idea is the retail mall. What's the retail mall? The retail mall is that the news organization links all the retailers in a town into essentially a virtual community where you could not only where they could not only advertise, but more importantly, you as a consumer could find out what the retailers and service providers are in your community. The dirty little secret about the Internet at this point is that Google and aggregation and search work only at a national and international level. It's great if you want to find out what movies, pick an actor, what other movies had they made, or what's the discography of a particular music artist, or what was it the Death March to Bataan or the Death March from Bataan? And Wikipedia can answer you that. But search is not that great at this point to find out where to buy a pair of sneakers in your town. What's the best running shoe store? Or where can I find a decent contractor in my town? Local search is still largely undeveloped. And the notion here would be that a newspaper which has that knowledge would create websites for all of those folks inside the newspaper or inside the news organization. And when people actually made transactions, ultimately, that fees would go to the news organization. This idea has been sort of floating there, but has not really been developed. Why? Because, as the publisher of the Dallas Morning News told me at one point, I have 3 programmers on my staff. I don't have the capacity to do this, which is a big part of the problem facing the news industry. To harness the information revolution, you need programmers, not just writers. And most news organizations don't have them. Another idea is niche products. What do we mean by niche products? We did a study recently about the size of the Washington Press Corps. Many of you probably heard that the number of journalists covering Washington for news organizations is decreasing dramatically, that the closing of Washington bureaus or the diminishment of Washington bureaus. And from a traditional general interest news standpoint, that is true. But actually, the overall number of journalists working in Washington hasn't changed in the last 10 years. How is that? Because many of them are working for niche newsletters that are producing content at high subscription fees for professional audiences. The largest Washington bureau today in the city belongs to Congressional Quarterly, which produces 36 niche newsletters. A few years ago, they produced 1. And it's the most profitable part of the St. Pete Times newspaper. St. Pete Times is having trouble making its debt payments, so what are they going to do? They're going to sell Congressional Quarterly to raise money. The only really profitable part of the operation. The possibility of local news organizations creating niche products really has not been explored very much, which is too bad because I guarantee you if the newspaper shrinks down much further, that the people who are going to produce a news website about land use in the town are going to be the people who have a vested financial interest in land use, developers and such. The same with water quality and all the other things. So the information that will exist in a community will be produced by people with a special interest in it. And that, I think, is a dangerous prospect. And then the last thing that really has not been discussed, surprisingly, is news organizations getting aggressive with people like Google or with institutions like Google and challenging them to pay for this content in a more serious way. Frankly, Google is so powerful that news organizations are afraid of challenging them. They're just trying to have meetings with them and figure out, is there some of this luster that we can share. So that's it. And I hope that that is provocative enough that you have some questions. And we've got about a half hour, right, to answer them.
Your comment about the websites and how easy it is for everyone to go to a particular website that they're looking for is true. But when we look at newspapers or magazines, we have that impulse buy. It's the intrigue of the ad that we didn't know we needed it. And it creates the interest. Where is that going to go?
Well, it's interesting. Advertising works differently in different medium. And traditionally, print advertising is information advertising. The ads are very detailed. There's a lot of specificity, and you find out that blenders are reduced 30% for the next 4 days. How many of you know that advertisement that often is a full-page ad in the New York Times from J&B Computers or whatever, and it's got like 50 products on it. And you go, wow, I can get that now. It's gone down another 10%. Well, television advertising is very different. Television advertising is not information-based as much as persuasion-based. The shorthand in Madison Avenue is TV advertising can make you want something you didn't know existed before. That's why these pharmaceutical ads, you go, do you have this? Do you have acid reflux where you go like this and you think, we've got the pill for you, and you think, I think I do have that disease. There is some serendipity to to sort of opening the page and seeing an ad, but none of that is really working on the internet. It's not like people are saying, you know what, print ads don't work on the internet, but video ads do. The interface with the video ads is not much better. There is some greater capacity if you're clicking on a video that there's an expectation that you have to wait for it to load, and there is some, apparently in the research, willingness for consumers to sort of wait while they're loading and watch an ad rather than watch that little dial fill up. But that's pretty limited, and it's contradictory. So there's some evidence that people don't even like that. There is one thing about serendipity that people were worried about, which is that when television came along, it dramatically increased what we call accidental or incidental news acquisition, which is a social science term for people basically learning stuff they didn't know they were interested in. Because in television, you have to watch the newscast from start to finish. And so people would go, I want to watch Walter Cronkite, and he'd say, the lead story tonight is this, and in a newspaper, you might have said, well, I'm not interested in that, I'll skip it. And in television and radio, couldn't do that. So people became aware of things that they might not have read before those media existed. And there was a great fear that that would completely disappear. In fact, that even the agenda setting of newspapers would vanish, because on the internet you can just find what you want. And it is true that we are online, we are on-demand news consumers, that we find what we want when we want it. But the notion that the serendipity of saying, I want to know what's new, has vanished is wrong. The research is very clear that even young people who are the most on-demand news consumers will go to Yahoo News or MSNBC and just see what the top stories are. Now, that page may be customized to a degree, but the notion of top stories is not one that has vanished. That the basic idea of what the saying in Swahili is habari gani, what's new. It's a transcultural instinct to basically find out, tell me what's important that I don't know about. And that the internet is not erasing.
What do you think about a model like the one in France where news would be, or traditional news outlets would be more or less nationalized?
Well, we're a strange country because our media is mostly local. France is a very small country with one big city, Paris, and there are many national newspapers, and there are many newspapers that are national that are targeted. There's a newspaper in France for stay-at-home moms. It's called 18 Minutes. I don't speak French, so I don't know what the lovely phrase is and what the title is in French. And the idea is you can read this newspaper in 18 minutes, and then you're going to go to the gym. Well, we don't have newspapers like that. They're that targeted in this country because we have 1,400 newspapers, and 1,397 of them are local, and only 3 of them are national. The other thing about European media is that they pay more for the newspaper. They make about 70% of their revenue from subscription or from circulation, and only 30% from ads. It's not as commercial a culture as ours. And people read multiple newspapers because they read national newspapers and think, well, this newspaper's going to tell me this, and this one's going to tell me about that point of view. And I think, as I've talked to people from Europe in particular, I think the parliamentary system is part of that. They have parties that reflect specific interests. In the United States today, the majority of Americans identify themselves as independent. not even Democrat or Republican. So the notion that our parties would somehow reflect our news would be reflected by parties, you know, the Republicans are not sure what they stand for. Democrats temporarily know what they stand for. They stand for Barack Obama, but that's fluid. That's fluid. So I think there are a lot of reasons that the European model doesn't work here, at least in our traditional newspapers. It may work to some extent in some other media. I think basically websites, as long as they're not sort of basic community news gathering sites like, you know, sort of the online version of the Chicago Tribune, you can see some of that. But those are, at this point, those things are not really commercial in nature. You know, most blogs are not making any money.
Hi. Your issue of the gatekeeper, part of the role of the web, and I think part of the trends that you're talking about have to do with intermediation. And I think that we saw that the Stephen Colbert roast, as we might call it now, got basically panned by the traditional journalists. 2 weeks later, it's the most downloaded thing on YouTube, and all of a sudden, the journalists are trying to figure out and trying to explain why this very critical Stephen Colbert, who was critical to the journalists, was dismissed so quickly.
Yeah.
So, can you, Professor, opine on that?
Well, I ain't no professor. That's there. You may have some out here in the audience, but I have a friend who's a professor, actually, more than one, who said to me that his students, teaches at Michigan State, he said his students go to the internet for facts, but they go to the Daily Show and Colbert Report for the truth, as they see it. One of the things that I think is wonderful about the new media and about social media and blogs, which I would put inside social media, is that stories that the press dismisses can have a second life. That there's a second judgment out there, that the press is not agenda setting alone. The press is an agenda setter, but not the agenda setter anymore. I do think, however, by and large, that the press is still the searchlight, that if it's not in the traditional press, that it's unlikely, not impossible, but it's unlikely for the new media to, for people, basically, to say, wait, this is important. And we see this in this new media index that we do every week, where some story that got almost no play becomes a major phenomenon in Reddit or Delicious or blogs or wherever. But in almost always, not always, but 90-something% of the time, it had to appear somewhere in the traditional press for people to know about it. But it could have been in the 43rd paragraph. I mean, we had several weeks earlier this year where a small company that could make prescription glasses for $10 a frame, which was in the 43rd paragraph of a New York Times story about what people were doing to respond to the financial crisis. And that company and their website became a huge phenomenon in the blogosphere. But somebody first found out about it in paragraph 43 of the New York Times. I do think that as traditional news organizations shrink further, you're going to see alternative. I mean, we already are seeing some. Voices of San Diego, MinPost, alternative news sites that are maybe organized by former news professionals or people who've been laid off or people who've wandered off, and that eventually we're going to see some that are truly amateur in the sense that they're not former professionals doing them. But even then, I think I liken these new alternatives to sort of the alternative weekly in a town. That might have 12 reporters, whereas the Chicago Tribune, I don't know, do you know what the number at the Tribune still is or is currently? Right. I mean, the fact is, even the much reduced, at 450 reporters and editors, that dwarfs all of the TV stations and radio people and everybody else in town combined. So although I'm not talking strictly about newspapers, the fact is, in any community in our country, if the newspaper goes down, that's where the real loss and sort of boots on the ground will be.
I have two questions briefly. First of all, you said that the internet media has not yet caught up to the traditional media in sort of investigative watchdog journalism, but you think that it might change soon, and I was wondering what made you think that. Second, wondering how you think the outlook is from the consumer's perspective for people in a city like Chicago that has several large news sources and in a smaller town where it might only have the one.
Yeah. Those are both good questions. I think, first of all, that, I was sort of, as I said before, the nonprofit, the potential for nonprofit to sort of take over ownership of the media is, I think I'm skeptical about. But the potential for nonprofits or volunteer sites to do targeted work, I'm much less skeptical of. What I'm skeptical of is that you could cover a community comprehensively this way. But the notion that you could do serious investigative work in a community, I think there's a greater likelihood of. For instance, ProPublica, which is the largest nonprofit news organization in the country right now, philanthropically funded. I don't include public broadcasting and NPR in this. They have a budget of $10 million a year, and that's not huge. The New York Times news budget is about $200 million a year. Okay, but the investigative news budget of the New York Times, the number of people who work for the New York Times who are doing watchdog exposés, that might not be too much more than about $10 million a year. If you wanted to finance science reporting or health reporting in a community, you could probably do that. What I don't think you could do is cover Waukegan and Skokie and Glencoe and Highland Park and everything in between the way that the Chicago Tribune aspires to. Now, what is that? That kind of leads to your next question about large news organizations versus smaller ones. What we see in the research and the data, and it's very clear and it's been clear for a few years, is that the news organizations that are hurting the most are large metro dailies, not the New York Times and not the very small newspapers. Why is this? Well, for one thing, those are the news organizations that aspire to sort of do everything. They aspire to be national and international, have foreign bureaus, and be very local. And in some ways, they're caught in the middle now, because anybody anywhere can go to the New York Times website or the Financial Times or the BBC and get news of an international nature and of a national nature. So that the Chicago Tribune's, domestic and foreign coverage may not compare very well to that. So by and large, what we're seeing is that the very, very, very local newspapers are not suffering financially, and they're not suffering their circulation loss. For one thing, many of them are free throwaway papers, what we call mass total market circulation, meaning we throw them on everybody's doorstep. We have no idea if they read them, but they're circulated there. But the other thing is that the advertisers who advertise in those very local newspapers, that's not Best Buy. They're not the ones who have websites that I can reach. They're small retailers who, that may be the only way they reach me. They may not even have any website. Or it may be some guy who's a handyman, or it may be a guy who cleans gutters or something like that. And so they still are operating in much the same way that they did before. The question is, can that be linked? I mean, online, the notion that you could create a whole community of those things exists potentially, but no news organization really has taken advantage of it. I mean, there is no page from my town on the Washington Post website, which is crazy. But they don't have any programmers, so they didn't build one.
A while ago, a left-wing commentator named David Sirota asked me to be his friend on Facebook. he's gathering quite a following.
My father-in-law's name is David Sirota. If it's the same one, don't do it.
Ooh, okay. But I'm wondering about that kind of social media, Twitter, Facebook, and if Pew is studying it, if you're looking at it in terms of its journalistic potential.
I don't think there's... Well, first of all, I'm on Facebook now. I've been there for about 8 months. And I get these, and I like, what do I do? Somebody wants to be my friend. I don't know who they are. I don't know. So I asked my 16-year-old, and she says, well, I never do that. I never friend anybody, because they might be like a, bad person. And I'm thinking, well, I know this guy's not a bad person. He's some reporter for some newspaper, but I don't know him. So do I friend? I don't, that all that is, it's not really answering your question. But what it suggests is that there's a lot of norms out there that are still evolving about that. Now, do I think that Wikipedia is going to become a news organization, or that social media and Facebook is going to become a news delivery system? Absolutely. I don't think there's any doubt. There's no stopping it. And regular news organizations, or traditional news organizations, have come to grips with that, I think, or are rapidly coming to grips with it. They want to be there because that's that rapidly moving stream that I was talking about. They want to push their content into that stuff. I mean, I don't know how many of you get emailed a story, a news story, or an op-ed or an editorial by friends on a regular basis. Yeah, everybody here. Me too, and a lot more than 6 months ago, and way more than 2 years ago. This is just and when somebody who I think is very smart emails me a story, I usually read it. For one thing, I know he's going to ask me about it. I'll look stupid if I didn't read it. But also, that's a very strong recommendation. So there's a logic to this. The other thing is in that statistics about how much more web traffic there is for news than there was a year ago. 2 years ago, that number wasn't rising very much. It was pretty stable. What's happened is the universe of people who use the internet for news hasn't grown. About 70% of people who are online, and about 70% of them get news online. What's changing is how often they do it. People are using the internet regularly as a kind of utility with a frequency and a fluidity that they didn't a year ago. And I think the election last year has accelerated that. People got used to it. They found it convenient. And by the way, the more you did it yesterday afternoon, the less you read the newspaper the next day, because you know a lot of that stuff already. So that's why that list of 6 things that the news aspires to be. By the way, I didn't put on there, I should have. I should add a 7th thing, which is a a presenter of new facts. But that's the diminishing part of the role. It's the sense maker authenticator idea that's growing.
I want to add a story to tell the one you've just told, and that is that when I was at University of Michigan, then President Mary Sue Coleman gave an address to the library publishers about the Google Library Project, and it was a very small, by invitation-only audience, but she gave a rip-roaring, in-your-face speech, which we thought was worth being heard. So one of my staff members sent it to all of the tech bloggers all over the world who write about Google regularly. It showed up in all of their blogs, and we got more email from alumni and friends of the university about that one speech she gave that none of them heard than we did about anything she ever did in public. It was absolutely fascinating to watch the power of that network in disseminating news in a way that was very, very real. I mean, they really thought they heard the speech. They were writing about content.
Or even a book like the last lecture by the guy who was ill. Would that have been able to become such a phenomenon in another era? I don't know the answer to that, but I think.
Not to mention Susan Boyle, right? Yeah. Go ahead.
So we're kind of being fed the idea that this is a crisis in journalism, and I mean, there certainly are not as many newspapers, 50 years ago as there were at the time of the revolution, and you don't have as many printings as you do. And as you said at the beginning of your speech, TV and radio also entered the game with a sort of wild card. To what extent do you think it's fair to call this something very new and very distinct, and how much of it is sort of an ongoing process of development that any industry goes through?
Yeah, that's a great question. A very important question. I would say, first of all, that this is much bigger than the advent of television or radio. This, I think, is on the scale of the invention of the printing press. The printing press was this incredibly powerful democratizing invention that allowed books to be mass-produced and allowed the church, which controlled basically what books were written. It diminished their power and led to the Enlightenment. It led to democracy. It had a huge impact. The telegraph was very important. We don't remember this. We don't sort of think about it. What the telegraph did in the 1840s was allow people to know the same thing across vast distances almost simultaneously. Radio added marginally to this. It allowed us to hear them for ourselves fairly rapidly. And then television allowed us to see the news for ourselves a little bit. But what the internet has done is it's created an entirely new power shift. It's taken power away from the intermediary, the press, and handed it over to the consumer. I don't think we're really our own journalists as much as really we are our own editors. We're editing our own news product for ourselves every day, and yours is different than the person sitting next to you. I think this is a crisis in journalism only from a financial standpoint. I think journalistically it's incredibly wonderful, because I have a slide that I didn't put up here that says if you were to cover an event in television, there are basically 4 elements you could have in the story. If you were to do it in print, there are 6 elements. I mean, a headline, a graphic, a photograph. My slide for how you could cover it in the internet currently has 49 elements that you could bring to the coverage. And the challenge for the journalist is, which of the 49 do you pick for this event? This is a richer journalism. This is a better journalism. And the consumer can then talk about it and do something about it and react to it. And I mean, it's incredible. But I do think, and this is my own history and bias, of course, that the fact that we had journalists who were commercially subsidized by advertising meant that we could have journalists who were beholden to no one. And they weren't beholden to the advertisers for the following reason. The economic or ethical theory behind this commercial journalism in the 20th century was it's okay to have advertisers subsidize you as long as you don't have any one advertiser or any one group of advertisers have too much of your market share. Because then the journalist could say, go to hell to any one advertiser. And in print, in particular, they did all the time. I mean, every newspaper publisher in America has had the experience of telling the car dealers or the realtors to go stick it when they said, if you don't fire this guy or whatever, we're going to pull our ads. And they've all seen this and said, okay, go ahead, pull your ads. And they know that they'll be back in 3 weeks or a month. Because they had so many advertisers and because they kind of had a monopoly over how to reach people. That created a luxury where journalists were really insulated, by and large, from what was much more of a problem for any of us who ever worked in the news business was the sacred cows of the publisher and his or her spouse or brother-in-law or whatever. I mean, I had a friend, I worked for the LA Times, a great newspaper. Otis Chandler was a great publisher, blah, 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 blah. But a very good friend of mine was their Africa correspondent, and he got a cable one day that said, go to Botswana. Otis Chandler's hunting guide has been arrested for poaching. Don't leave the country until you've freed him. He was there for 4 months.
I would really like to hear more about why the news institutions aren't taking on the online aggregators. I was actually working as a programmer on a site, and I ended up calling a lawyer because I was sure the site was illegal because they're literally just ripping off content. But as long as you, I guess, fair use, as long as you have some sort of link or attribution, then you're fine. And so I'm curious, and the lawyer said there's just no good precedent. So I'm curious what the logic is for why they're not taking this on.
I think that there's a bunch of reasons. One is there's no case law. So they're not sure what would happen. And lawyers, my wife happens to be one, they work on case law. They'd say, well, do you have a case? Well, look it up. Nope, you don't have a case because there's no case law. Now, if there is no case law, you have to have a proactive attorney, and you have to basically, be wanting to create policy. Another is that any one site sealing one thing is pretty marginal, and it's going to go away. The news is so perishable, which is part of its problem, which is part of why we can't charge for it, because the marginal value of, I may think the New York Times is the best newspaper, but the marginal difference between the New York Times version and the AP version or the Reuters version is not so great that I'm willing to pay for one if I can get the other one for free. And newspapers just were acutely aware of this and thought, well, what the hell? What good is it going to do us? They didn't fight the fight early, because also, by the way, they were still making 30% profit or 20% profit, and they thought, well, it's whatever. The bigger problem may have been, at the same time they were not doing that, not taking on the aggregators, because they thought they weren't important enough until they became so important, then they were intimidated by them. They didn't want to actually alienate Google, because what if Google said, you know what, you're going to sue us? We won't include you in our search. And that seemed worse. And really, as I've watched this over the last 12 years, you just think, oh my God, this is the railroad industry. This is the auto industry. They're so bound by the way they've thought that by the time they're going to think differently, you just hope it's not too late. Now, if it is, other people are going to invent new ways of gathering the news. What I don't know is, will they convey the values of traditional journalism when they do it? And I think they might. But more importantly, will they figure out a revenue model that will allow their newsrooms to be robust enough that the press will be an important institution and not just sort of something that's kind of just barely keeping up? We may be just barely keeping up as it is. And if we shrink even further, that worries me.
So you said that news organizations are no longer going to be just writing stories. They're also going to be aggregating, authenticating, and making sense of everyone else's stories. Right. But if all news organizations are doing this, where are the stories going to come from? And more importantly, who's going to be on the ground doing actual reporting instead of in their cute little office churning out a bunch of fluff?
Well, there's different kinds of journalism now. There's different kinds of news, right? Watching Obama give a speech is news, but it's not the kind of news that requires an investigative reporter. And it is the kind of news that 10 years ago or 15 years ago, news organizations said, well, we all have to have our own cameras. Now they have one camera and they pool it. And we may get to the point where it actually might be a feed. That worries me if it were a government feed. But we're moving in that direction. I think what we have to realize is that first account of things is gotten to the point where some of that news is a commodity. What did the stock market do today? I really don't care whether it's the Reuters story or the AP story. I just want to know what the number was. You go from that, the most sort of basic level of commodity, news as a commodity, and you move on up. And that's where it becomes more complicated. At what point do I actually need to read an intermediary about this? And where does the news organization enter in as a truth seeker and not just a stenographer? The stenographic commodity news, I think, is the easy part to take care of. We're going to know what Obama said yesterday, and we'll know what Nancy Pelosi said yesterday. Somehow, that will be taken care of. I'm not so worried about that. It may be that that's shared. What I'm worried about is what is it that anybody in power doesn't want us to know, and how are we going to know about that? And that requires more skill, and it requires more courage, and it requires a lot of other things. And an important part of that, I think, is comprehensiveness. We're going to know what happened at the White House. Are we going to know what happened at the City Council? Well, we'll know what happened in the City Council in Chicago, I suspect. You don't even call them city council. What do you call them? Aldermen? City council? Okay. But what about Evanston? And on, and on beyond. That worries me a lot. And that is commodity. That basic news, too. So, I mean, there are a lot of levels to that, and I didn't do a very good job answering your question. But, I think what news organizations are worried about is how do we do the news that isn't everywhere, that not everybody is doing, that's not just out there somehow automatically. I mean, Reuters literally basically gives away their general interest news. They make their money on financial information, and what we see from Reuters is a lost leader to them. It's not really where they make their revenue. But doing that is a foundation for them to do the niche stuff that people have to pay a lot of money for. And there's some model in there.
Great. So thanks, Tom, for everything. I wonder if I was thinking about the models that you were talking about, like the watchdog function, which is clearly something that the Tribune is moving more towards. I mean, they actually just did, in the latest reorg, a big renewed emphasis on having a new watchdog team that includes now environment reporters and health and so forth. And so they're sort of focusing on what they can distinctively do well. But what I'm worried about there, I mean, there's a lot to worry about, but one of the things is that that makes sense from a journalistic standpoint, sort of making the best of the resources you have left. But I wonder if if it's possible to do anything if you're not doing everything, because the reason people went there was they're not making money off the watchdog journalism. I mean, the reason people went there was that there was something for everybody.
Right.
And so I wonder if what can be a viable journalistic model for the moment is not really an economic model.
Yeah, and and that functions on a few levels. I mean, where's the public square if everybody's going to these little tiny cubicles for information? I was actually I was doing a radio show, and a caller called in and said, "You know what I would pay for?" I said, "No, what would you pay for?" She said, "I would pay for somebody to tell me to create the internet for me, and a different version of the internet for my husband based on his interests, and another one for my 13-year-old daughter, Clara, and another one for my 9-year-old son. And for her kids, what she wanted was one that filtered out some stuff, but also pushed things at them that they would be interested in." And in a sense, that is a news organization that, as I said before, sort of does what it does best and then very, very smartly gathers up the rest. So that brilliant aggregation, I think, is going to become an important part. And maybe even if you're the Chicago Tribune, you go out and you encourage these people in different communities. Nurture them, be the role model or whatever for the things that you can't do. Teach them how to do it and help them. But they become part of a network that you use. It's not that you cede the coverage to them, but they are sort of the sentinels who tell you early. They're an early warning system of citizens who go to these places if you can't send a professional. And then you send somebody out after them when you see trends and things like that. I mean, this is sort of crude thinking, but these are the experiments that news organizations need to try out and see what's viable and what works, because we have reached the point where the idea of covering the waterfront is gone. You're going to have to say, okay, let's take every third warehouse or every fifth warehouse and cover just cover those, and then you have no idea what's going on in the other warehouses. And the Detroit experiment is a good example. Why are the Detroit newspapers only printing 3 days a week in one case and 2 days a week in the other? The reason is that newspapers don't make their money evenly through the week. They make half of all their revenue on Sunday, and they make a bunch on the day that the food section comes out. And there are some days of the week where they really don't make any at all. They lose money on the paper. So what the Detroit papers have done is they said, we're not going to print on those days, So we'll save the 40% of our costs that go into printing and delivering on those days, but we won't lose 90% of our revenue because we only make 5% of our revenue on those days. What they don't know is it could destroy the newspaper completely, because people might say, you know what, I live without it 4 days of the week. I don't need it at all. So they may actually hasten their demise. I think what news organizations need to do is experiment in this town with this, experiment in that town with this, try this out here, not do this thing that is one size fits all. This is the way we're going to do it, because they don't know if that's going to work or not. So one of the things that kind of is frustrating is, why don't they try something that they could do at scale in these 3 towns, small towns? See how it works. Find out whether, if you were one more little shtick that I sometimes mention. The problem facing the news business is that it's a dying industry in one platform, the most profitable one, and an emerging industry in another. And it doesn't know how to behave like an emerging industry. They don't know how to, they're not Silicon Valley companies that think about building market share over 4 or 5 years and then figuring out inventing an economic model once they've created a market. They don't know how to do that. They've never done that. They did it in 1890, but the people who aren't around anymore who did that. And so they only know how to operate as a shrinking industry. Their response, by and large, is cutting costs. And the people who worked at the editors who kept leaving the LA Times, that was their complaint, that Chicago has no theory. They just keep cutting costs. Well, I would project that out across the industry for the most part.
This is endlessly fascinating. We can go on for a long time, and I'm sorry to those of you whose questions we didn't get to, but I know that Tom is willing to stay a few minutes afterwards if you'd like to talk to him individually. We didn't have any time to talk about what this means for universities, but I just want to leave you with something to chew on, and that is, when I left his presentation in Washington, I found my head buzzing with all of these spaces where there might be opportunities for universities and the things that universities produce. And so for me, this was fodder for a lot of imaginative and creative thinking, and I hope that you'll leave with a few of those ideas kind of buzzing around in your skull as well. So in any case, I thank you for coming today. Please join me in thanking Tom for his presentation.